This is organizational ethics. So the obvious, I mean, presumably you know what organizations are, so I'm not going to worry about that part. What is ethics? Ethics is the part of philosophy that deals with practical issues, questions about what to do. And in fact, as I've often thought it, ethics consists of two basic questions. There's a third that I think is intimately tied up with them. I'll get to that in a moment. But the first question, you might say, is what should I do? Ethics is a part of practical reasoning, trying to figure out what to do in various kinds of situations. And so the basic question of ethics is just, how do we go about making decisions about that? How do we actually think about action, think about problems, think about problem solving? How do we reach decisions? Are there principles that should guide us? Are there general patterns that we should follow? Are there things we ought to avoid? And so this is really the focus of most modern moral philosophy. It thinks about this question, what should I do? It develops criteria, for example, for right action. It examines decision-making processes and deals with theories of those processes. A second question is of increasing interest to modern theorists, but was really the primary way that ancient ethical theorists thought about this, not only in ancient Greece, but ancient China, and a variety of other traditions, in India, for example. It was really not what should I do, but what should I be? What kind of person should I be, in other words? And so here the question is, what character should I try to develop in myself? What kind of person do I want to be? What are good traits of character? Those are called virtues. What are bad traits of character? Those are called vices. So this becomes a question of virtues and vices, trying to determine what are good traits of character, bad traits of character, what kinds of persons ought to be discouraged, what you should steer people away from, what you should steer people toward, in terms of their own conception of themselves. Well, there's an obvious connection between these two. It would be very odd to have a virtuous person, somebody who was the kind of person that people ought to be, but nevertheless was consistently doing the wrong thing. It would also be odd to have somebody who was consistently doing the right thing, but nevertheless was a vicious person. So there's some link between these. But what exactly is the link? In order to make sense of that, we might add a third question, which is, on what reasons may I act? That's connected with this question of decision making. There are presumably certain things I should be appealing to in making decisions, and other things I really shouldn't be thinking about in making decisions. So the question here is, how do I really, you might say, what kinds of criteria, what kinds of considerations may I introduce into my thinking about practical problems? We don't have to think of all of these as applying to particular moral questions as such. They really arise in connection with any sort of practical problem. And so in an organization, you might think, yeah, okay, how should I go about making decisions in this organization? What should I do? What kind of employee or manager or whatever should I be? And then on what reasons may I act? In other words, what kinds of considerations am I supposed to consider in thinking about what to do and in general conducting myself? Well, there are a variety of attitudes we might have about how all of these questions interconnect. And the reason I introduced the third is because Aristotle at one point introduces a sort of schema for linking these together. I'm going to call this Aristotle's dictum. Dictum is just Latin for thing said. It'd be better to have something Greek, given that Aristotle's Greek. But anyway, here's the idea. A virtuous person isn't just somebody who does the right thing, he says. A virtuous person does the right thing for the right reason. Now, actually, he says it in a somewhat more complex fashion. He says a virtuous person is someone who does what they ought to do at the right time, toward the right object, in the right circumstance, in the right way, and for the right reason. But he's thinking there in terms of kinds of action, which is why he feels that he has to specify the time and place and circumstance and object and all of that. if we think that's built into the particular action we're talking about, then really we can simplify it to this. A virtuous person does the right thing for the right reason. Well, more or less everybody is going to agree with that, at least most of the time. Even virtuous people make mistakes, etc., etc. But in general, that's going to be true. But now, if there's that sort of link between these three questions, which is primary? Most thinkers about ethics have tried to take one of these ideas as primary and then build the others out. So one way of looking at this is something like virtue is, well, right thing plus right reason, right? But the thought is, well, maybe if we had one of these and really understood it and took it as basic, we could understand the others in terms of it. So what kinds of relationships could we have? How, in other words, are these linked? What's really basic? What could we take as basic there? What do you think is most basic? Should we start with what kind of person you ought to be, thinking about good traits and bad traits? Should we think about what right action is, what it is to act correctly, and to develop maybe rules for acting? Or should we start with the question of right reasons? In other words, what are the kinds of considerations you ought to be thinking about? Which considerations should you be putting aside and not thinking about? Which of those do you think is the most basic question?
What should I be?
What should I be? Okay, so here is one option. It's the option of what is generally known as virtue ethics. Okay, and it says, what should I be is primary. So it says two is really primary. We start with that question, okay? So we figure out what a virtuous person is, what a good character trait is, and then we can define the others in terms of that. How could we do that? Well, we could say, okay, what about one then? For question one, we could say, what should I do? Well, here's the answer to that one. Do what a virtuous person would do. And indeed, that's exactly the way Aristotle tells us to think about things. He talks about, and we'll talk a lot more about him on Friday, but the idea is, think about what good character traits are, bad character traits, think about what a virtuous person is, and then imitate that person. There's a lot of that idea in Confucius too, as we'll see. You start with that, and then you say, do what that person would do. And indeed, sometimes that's the way people think about these programs, right? I mean, what are, the bracelets, what would Jesus do? Okay, that's a little bit like this. I presume in other religions there are things like, what would the Buddha do? And so on. But that's sort of this type of thing. I don't know, what would Donald Trump do? I mean, you might have a hero and think, okay, what would that person do, etc. So that's one way of looking at this. In general, Aristotle at some point says, look, here's the idea. If you want to become a good person, have a good role model. Pick a person you want to be like, and then try to be like them. And so that's one way of looking at this. Say, find somebody you think is virtuous, find somebody you want to imitate, and imitate them.
So you need to study that. So you study that person, you study their traits.
Exactly,
Okay.
right. You study that person, study their traits, try to behave in the way they would behave, and decide things in the way they would decide. Years ago, our dean in liberal arts, not the current one, but somebody else, had a heart attack when he was visiting Philadelphia. And the rest of the staff ran the College of Liberal Arts without him being there, basically by getting together and saying, what would Bob King do? Okay, that was our dean at the time. And he had been dean for many years, and they'd worked with him for a long time, and it really just was, all right, we can't really bother him with this, but what would he do? What would he say? And that's how they thought of it. Yeah?
I was wondering if you started with the right reason, how would that kind of break down? If you pick that to be the beginning point, figuring out what the right reason is.
Ooh, good. Well, right. So an alternative path here would be to say, don't start with that. Let's start with question 3, on the basis of what reasons may I act. And that gives us a view that is sometimes called deontology. It is a rationalist approach to ethics, since it's connected with reasons. And it really starts with that question. It says, yeah, 3 is primary. But now if we do that, then how do we answer question 1? We can't any longer say, do what a virtuous person would do. What could we say? Now what should you do? I start with this idea of what reasons are. Yeah.
I have a question though. Are we basing this on the fact that we already know what virtue is?
No. No, good. That's going to be one of the things we talk about a lot on Friday. Because Confucius is going to give us a list of virtues. The Taoists will give us a list of virtues. Aristotle gives us a list of virtues. We're going to talk some about just our own common sense in the 21st century. What are our lists of virtues? And we're going to find out, wow, they're really different. There's some overlap.
But for the purpose of this exercise, are we assuming that
Yeah, for this-
okay, we have a baseline virtue?
Right, for the
Okay,
moment, we'll
okay.
assume we agree about that. But yeah, it's a good question, because lots of virtue ethicists actually start with the same starting point, but then have a really different list of virtues, a very different conception of what the ideal person is. And that can make those theories really different. If you start thinking, what would so-and-so do? Then depending on who you fill in for so-and-so, it's going to look really different. So yeah, here, actually, since we didn't quite finish this off, how can we talk about reasons in connection with virtues? Maybe that will help us in thinking about this one. I'm trying to say, on what reasons may I act? Well, the reasons a virtuous person would use, right? So, act on reasons a virtuous person would consider. Okay, so Aristotle is our example of this sort of thinker, and we'll be dealing with him a lot, but he's not the only one. Plato also really is like this. We'll consider a Platonic dialogue on Friday. A lot of people think of Confucius as one of these. I don't think that's quite right, as we'll see in a moment. Deontology, this is where Immanuel Kant is going to fit in. He's the leading advocate of this kind of view in Western philosophy, but there are a lot of contemporary philosophers who are also very attracted to this reasons as basic idea. All right, so we want to say, what should I do? I know what a good reason is. Then how could I say what to do?
I think a lot of it goes back to what's kind of called the golden rule, which is that a lot of different religions do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So how would I want to be treated?
How would I-
Then
Ooh.
I treat others that way.
Okay, good, good. So if I think about action now, there are a number of things I can do. And one of them is I can say, yeah, what reasons would I want somebody to be considering, right? And then I should consider those same things. So let's say what's a good example of this in the context of organizations? Maybe I'm a manager allocating raises. And I think, well, what would I want my boss to be thinking about in allocating raises? I should presumably, though, use the same criteria. I've got to be careful in applying that kind of thing, right? Because I might think I would want my boss to give it all to me. So I should take those for my subordinates. Keep it all. I want to do that. Actually, my father once quit a job because of precisely that. They gave his boss a bunch of bonus money and he just kept it all for himself. But anyway, yes, we could use something like the golden rule. And as we'll see, Confucius has something closely related to that, which is sometimes called the silver rule. Don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself. It's a kind of purely negative version, whereas the golden rule is positive. Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. So that's one option, to have a rule like that that's going to play this kind of function and specify reasons in connection with that. Some people think of it in a slightly different way. Have you ever encountered people saying, here's how you go about making a decision, list a bunch of advantages, list a bunch of disadvantages, and then see which list is longer? I mean, that's kind of dumb in a way, because what if the disadvantage is, oh, I end up dead? I don't really care how many things are on this side necessarily, depending on what the situation
Well, I
is.
think like it's not necessarily which one's longer, but which one do you value more? Like,
Which one do you value more? Exactly.
or
And
do
so,
you place more weight on?
precisely. In fact, that's a very ancient idea for thinking about this. You sort of imagine that you've got these scales, right? And reasons are like weights on the scale. So here's a reason in favor of this. Ooh, here's a reason against. Well, this is a reason in favor. Oh, that's a pretty big reason against. And so on and so forth. And you're really thinking about weighting, exactly right. And so if you have this model, you're not going to say it's a matter of counting these. It's a question of which ones are really important, which ones are weighty, which ones are really the most significant. And so an alternative to something like the golden rule or the silver rule or some other sort of principle like that is to say, act, maybe I should just say do what you have most reason to do. And that might be understood in terms of this weighting model or something like that, where you're saying, all right, here are considerations in favor, considerations against. A reason for something is a consideration in favor of it. A reason against something is a consideration that weighs against it. I sort of imagine myself weighing all these up, and then I do what I have most reason to do. How can I think about what kind of person I should be if I take the third as basic?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, what about laws? So,
Ooh,
I
yes,
have
yes.
laws that tell me I can't do something. So, there's a structure to my culture, my society, or my country, or whatever, and so how does that play?
Good. How do we think about that? Actually, no, I'm sorry, I erased that, because one way to think about it is to think of laws or very strong moral constraints as something like very heavy weights. This would be the best for our business. There's only one problem. It's illegal, right? Oh, that's a pretty bad problem. So we could just think of that as a big weight there. On the other hand, some people think that's the wrong way to look at it. Because if I think of that kind of problem as just a big weight, I'm going to end up thinking of it like this, right? I've got this, and it's like, ooh, the law here. And that outweighs what's over on this other side. But I could think, well, if I added enough things on this side, that would be enough to outweigh that, right? And so maybe, from that point of view, you could say, look, sometimes you should do what's illegal because actually the weights are in favor of it. In companies, that's dangerous. On the other hand, in our private lives, we do it all the time. How many of you have never gone over the speed limit? How many of you have never told a lie? So, there are basically, actually, I've got to do it right now. Not this second, I mean, but I was sort of stupid and wait. Texas has changed its car registration thing, so you have to get it inspected before you can renew your registration. And my Miata is having problems. The check engine light keeps coming on, even though it's driving fine, so it won't pass inspection, so I can't get it registered. But on the other hand, the only way to reset the things to see if they've actually fixed it is to drive it. So I've got to drive it, but without now a valid registration. I started this process like a month ago, but it's like as soon as they get one little code to go away, another one pops up, etc. And so it's like, I've got to, the only way, either I just abandon the car or I do the thing. And so there can be reasons now. And on one model, we want the law to just be one reason among others, but a pretty weighty one. From another point of view, you might say, no, there are certain things that are absolute constraints. So some theorists are what are known as natural law theorists. They think there's something like a natural law that is the kind of constraint you cannot violate. Let's say, we could increase profits if we did this, but, this means we have to wipe out an entire village of innocent people. Probably you want to say, that's not just, how much could we make, right? This model says, maybe if we made enough, it'd be okay. But you might think, no, that's an absolute moral constraint. We could never do that. And that's going to imply either that some things have an infinite weight here, or that the weighting model is not the right thing. That you need this weighting model plus some constraints, like don't kill innocent people, don't break the law, etc., that you would then have to specify. So that's a great question. This is something that sits ambiguously between those two ways of thinking about this. Okay, well, if we're thinking about reasons as basic, then we think, what kind of person should I be? how can I explain that in terms of reasons?
Rational?
Good, well, yeah, that's right, I should be rational, right? And so, there's a very interesting response on this view. I should be a rational person. In fact, being a moral person and being a rational person will look really similar from this point of view. Because what I should do is, or what I should be, is the kind of person who will decide on the basis of the right reasons. And that, since those are the right reasons to act by, that means I should be rational. So, one way to put it is just be a rational person. And that's one way of seeing exactly what Kant's theory of virtue is. Say, be a rational person. A rational person is going to decide according to the right reasons for making that decision. Be a person like that. Yeah.
But what defines what is rational?
Good. Okay, just as here we've got this very basic problem like, wait, what's a virtue and what's a vice, right? And there's lots of room for disagreement. So here we've got lots of room for disagreement about what reasons are legitimate and what reasons aren't. And that means we're going to have lots of room for disagreement over what exactly is rational. So, absolutely right. Even if people are on the same page in the sense that they take this approach, that's not the end of ethical discussion, because the huge question then is, well, what's a good reason for something? How do we decide what we have most reason to do? What is to really be rational in that sense? And there's still plenty of room for disagreement. Just as here, do what a virtuous person would do, but wait, what's a virtuous person? So all of these are going to try to simplify by relating some of these questions to one that is taken as basic. But then there's going to be lots of space for people to give different theories of what that basic thing is. All right, well, we've looked at virtue ethics. It takes that question about what I should be as basic. Also is on deontology, which, by the way, just comes from the Greek term for binding. So it's about the things that bind us, that constrain us, you might say. And then another approach will be to say, well, we should take one as basic, okay? That view is a view that, how can yeah, boy. Well, here's why this is too simple. I'm tempted to say, because we're going to think about one primary version of this, but it's not exact. I'll do it anyway. I'm cheating. But this is not sort of what it is to be such a person. It is just the most salient approach to this that we're going to look at. Consequentialism says number one is primary. Now, we're going to look at it later in the course, and it also says, oh, and by the way, in thinking about what to do, just look at the consequences of action. That's where it gets its name. You don't have to be that kind of person. Any action-oriented ethical theory is going to look like this. Most corporate codes of conduct are going to fall into this approach, whether or not they have that character, because they're going to say, here are the things you may not do. Here's what you do in the case of conflict of interest or something. They're giving you guides for action. And so this is actually a much broader category. This is one particular instance of it. But suppose we take that as primary. We say, here's how you should go about making decisions. Here's what you ought to do. Now, here are things you should not do. Well then, how do we explain what kind of person you should be? How do we account for virtues? What's a good person according to this model? I tell you what to do and what not to do. Now, what is it to be a good person?
Don't do the wrong thing.
Yeah, they don't do the wrong thing. Do things out of it, right. So, basically, a virtuous person is one who does what he or she ought to do, and of course avoids what he or she shouldn't do. And then, what could we say about reasons? I've told you what to do and what not to do, and now what reasons may you consider in thinking about that?
The right reasons versus the wrong reasons?
Well, true. Can you tell me more about what a right reason is?
No.
I mean, here's one approach. Some will say, I don't care what your reasons are. In fact, at one point, John Stuart Mill basically says that. He says, I want you to do the right thing, but I actually have no interest in the question of how you get there. Maybe you're doing the right thing because you've done a calculation and figured out it has the best consequences, which is what he thinks in the end makes it right. Maybe you're doing it because your kindergarten teacher told you to do it, or your mommy once told you to do it. It's okay with me. I don't care why you're doing it. I just want you to do the right thing. So one option is to just say, I don't care about your reasons. And some consequentialists have that approach. Others will say, well, look, a virtuous person does what they ought to do. Maybe we should say, this sort of person is going to think about the reasons that will lead to them doing the right thing. Okay? So it's really going to be a question of, how do I phrase it? Yeah, act on reasons that tend to lead to the right result. In the end, what matters is what you do, or what you have managed to avoid doing. And so whatever reasons are going to lead you to the right result are the right reasons to think about.
So is this like the end justifies the means?
You bet. That's why consequentialism is called that. It's sort of like, consequences justify everything else. So, again, not all versions of this number one primary approach are like that, but a lot of them are. Really, it's the end justifies the means in the end. Think about whatever is going to lead to the right action, and then that's typically defined in terms of what then produces the best result, the best consequences. Well, those are three approaches that lots of people have taken, but there is a fourth possibility. Oh, go ahead.
Just to be
Okay.
devil's advocate, do we have defined what the right result is? Or is
That-
that some bigger?
All right, good. Just as here we had this fishy term, virtuous person, right? We have to figure out what that is. And here we had this idea of what is rational, or what we have most reason to do. Here, it's going to be a question of, what you should do, or what is the right result. And so, exactly right. We're going to have to say on this view, here's what you should do, maybe, as the consequentialists will say, bring about the best consequences, act for the best overall. But now, what do you mean the best? In an organization, it's going to be really tempting for people to say, oh, that's whatever the mission of our organization defines as the result we're looking for. So maybe it's making the most money, or maybe it's helping the most people. Maybe it is treating the most patients, or whatever. It's going to be something that that organization will define. And a danger is that if it's a definition that is a little too myopic, it's going to mean that in serving the interests of the organization, you're not serving the interests overall.
Right.
And that can happen within organizations. What's best for the philosophy department may not be what's best for the College of Liberal Arts. Basically we think, what's best for us? Give us more money, more money, more money. Well, often giving the philosophy department more money is not best for the college. What's best for the college isn't necessarily what's best for UT Austin. That's not necessarily what's best for the UT system, or the state of Texas, or the country, or the world. And so, in short, there's going to be not only the question of what do you mean by right result, but at what level are we talking here? Right result for what group of people? For everybody? For our organization? A group within the organization? Our community? But there are lots of levels of specificity there. Yeah.
And what role does religion play in all this?
Good question. What role does religion play in all of this?
Because some religions might have the right thing to do would be one thing, or they have their own set of laws, or own set of norms.
Right, exactly. So,
Religion
every
also-
religion does give you some moral directives, right? Yeah.
Is that, the religion has that invisible hand of what, do the right thing even if no one's watching, because, and then the religion comes in and says, well, there is something watching, right, at all times, so.
Okay, yes. At least often it does. Buddhism doesn't really. You're supposed to do it for your own interests, not because Buddha is watching you. But yes, most religions are like that. And one way of looking at this is to say, I guess one way, a very common way these days, is to say a religion is trying to embody what is really right. But there's an ancient question asked in Plato's dialogue, The Youth of Rome. Is this right because God approves of it, or is God approving of it because it's right? If it's the latter, if God is approving it because it's right, then religion might be helpful because it's a summary of lots of people's ideas about what God approves and disapproves, because those are supposed to be the right things to do. But on the other hand, that's not giving you an independent analysis of what makes them right. It's just sort of like a helpful guide. On the other hand, you might think, no, I think God's playing a much more important role, and religion is much more central, because look at the things I put the wavy lines on. Maybe God's defining what a virtuous person is. It's not up to me or you or our community or something. It's really up to God what a good person is. And the same thing here. What is it to be rational? Maybe that's something that God defines. The same thing with what the right result is. And so it's common in secular ethics these days to assume that, look, God approves what's right just if there is a God and so on, just because it's right. And so we can push religion off to the side. However psychologically helpful it is to think about God watching you. Just this past week, I was refinishing some bookshelves. And I was, staining these parts that you'd never see. I was thinking, yeah, but God sees them. And in a bookshelf, it really doesn't make any difference, but in the ethical life, it might make a lot of difference, right? Do you go through that red light when nobody seems to be around, and so on? It might be something that's really important, psychologically. But those thinkers think it's only psychologically interesting, it's not really important in another way. But it could be important in a much more fundamental way because of these squishy terms at the basis that I've underlined. A really appealing way to think about those, and a highly stable way in various ways, is to say, no, that's the part that comes from outside of ethics. If we all sit around and say, what's a good person, and we're going to do that on Friday, we'll actually form a pretty good consensus. But the bigger the group is, the smaller the things about which we'll find agreement becomes. And you might think in the end, there better be an anchor for all of this outside of ethics proper. And religion is a really good place to find that kind of anchor. So anyway, we're not going to talk a lot about that through the course, but I think it's a deep question you're raising and a really important question. And a question I don't know the answer to. I mean, if I were not a religious person, I would think I did know the answer to it, but since I am, I don't know what exactly to say about it. Okay, well there is one other option I want to think about here. Because we've said, look, we might take question 1 as basic, or 2 as basic, or 3 as basic. But there's another alternative. You might take more than one of these as basic. In fact, we could think they're all basic, that none reduces to the others. Right. So there is an option that we might summarize as intuitionism, or as what I think of as common sense ethics, which is really to say none is primary. Each of them has its own independent contribution. So I just have to think about what I ought to do and what things I may not do. I have to think about what kind of person I should be. I have to think about what kinds of reasons I can use as considerations in reaching decisions. And those are just different, though related questions. I started out by saying there must be some connection, because after all, imagine a virtuous person who never managed to do what they actually ought to do. But now, is that possible? Could you have a virtuous person? You'd say that's a good person. Nevertheless, they never actually do what they ought to do. They're constantly doing things they shouldn't be doing. Can you make any sense of that idea at all?
I think that happens all the time.
Ah, explain.
I mean, if you come from the idea that everybody's intrinsically good, which is what most religions teach, but most people make bad decisions sometimes. I mean, it was kind of like you said, have you ever ran a stoplight? Have you ever lied? Have you ever, so if we're all intrinsically good, we all
good.
do, or virtuous or what have you, if you have these, I don't know what I'm going for.
No, well, good.
Right.
Look, suppose you do think people are basically good, but then you look around at the world and you think, so why aren't things better? Right? You might think a lot of good people are nevertheless making a lot of moral mistakes and doing things wrong. You could have an opposite view. You could be a Calvinist who believes in the total depravity of man, and you think people are basically selfish and bad. Left to our own, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, with Thomas Hobbes. And so why is it actually life is pretty good most of the time? And that becomes a puzzle of a different kind. But you're right, it might be that basically nasty people nevertheless do a lot of good, And really good people, nevertheless, screw things up a lot, right? And both of those are possible. And so we could say, look, those are different questions. And yeah, there's some connection between them, but look, people can make lots of mistakes. Maybe, in fact, people are so often making mistakes, we can't say mistakes are an exception. And gosh, in an organization, that becomes, I think, even more obvious because you don't know what the long-term considerations are often. You reorganize your group, what are the effects of that? They might be very far-reaching, and it's impossible to know when you're doing it, what they even are.
Well, I think that some of them intertwine too, though, because it's like, what should I do? Okay, well, so I'm a good person doing a wrong thing for what I feel are the right reasons. So it could be 2 out of the 3 that are aligned, you know, like.
That's right.
So.
Oh, absolutely right. I might be doing the wrong thing, but for the right reason. I'm thinking about the right thing. I'm just wrong about the facts, right? So I think, look, I really want to do this, and so I'm going to do that, and actually I'm screwing it all up by doing that, but it's because I don't really understand the situation. Or maybe you're somebody who is a good person and trying to do, actually doing the right thing, but actually for completely the wrong reason. You know, you're promoting the person who is the best person for the job and will do an outstanding job, but you're actually doing it because that person's a friend. And you think, I don't know, but still, I can't face my buddy and if I don't give him the promotion, so you do it, bad reason, but nevertheless, maybe that was the right thing to do. And so you're right, these often don't go together. And according to this view, yeah, you shouldn't expect them to go together. Not only all the time, maybe even normally. Those are just different questions, and they're all important, they all matter, and you have to think about all of those at once. So I think in common sense, we think those are important questions, but I think we don't have a theoretical commitment to one of them being basic. It's just all going on, and we have to think about all of it. And as I see it, Confucius is somebody like that. So let's actually think about Confucius, since I've been blathering on and on about the general one, but now we can see what he's doing, I think. What is Confucius up to? He's the most influential person in the history of China. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, before we move on to that, could there be one where we think that all life primary? So basically that you need to go through all 3 questions before you act, like what should I do, what should I be, and what reasons may I act before you even take action?
Actually, that's another way of putting this basic view. I could say either that none are primary or really that all are primary.
Okay.
And what I mean is nothing reduces to anything else. So yeah, I probably that's a better way of putting it than to say none is primary. Here what I just meant, none is basic in the sense that the others depend on it. So maybe I should say none is reducible to the others. That would be a fairer way of putting it. So yeah, that really does mean all of them are primary, all of them are basic. Yes?
Where does emotion and impulsivity fit in here? Like when I'm emotional, I might speed through this, or I might say, well, just because. And if you know, I'm not able, I can tell you I am doing it, but I can't give you the logical reason. Where does...
Good question. Right. Where do emotions fit into this picture? We haven't talked about that at all. And yet emotions are really vital in thinking about ethics. But how do they connect to these 3 questions?
I think it fits in kind of like what you were saying, like, or the example you said, like, I'm doing the wrong thing, or the right thing, but for the wrong reasons. Maybe that's where like emotion plays in, because like the back of the mind, you know you're doing it for the wrong reasons, but it's still the right thing, or.
Yeah, I think emotion ties into reason, for sure.
Ah, good. It is connected to reasons, I agree, because if I'm thinking about these reasons, they're typically going to be things about which I have certain feelings, right? Now, maybe not necessarily. I might not have strong feelings about, well, for example, a friend got very upset about what was happening in the Middle Eastern Studies Department. And I might have no feelings whatever about the Middle Eastern Studies Department. I think, who cares? so even though if I were dean, I guess I could say, well, okay, now it's my responsibility. I should think about this, but still, I might not really. So not all reasons have feelings accompanying them, but they often do. And there are two things I think we can say about this general question, and it is really important. One is something that Confucius says. Confucius says, look, feeling actually plays a crucial role in ethics, because how do I actually decide what to do? Really, emotions are vital to that. And psychological research has shown that that's true. If people suffer brain injuries that actually disable emotions, they find it enormously difficult to make decisions. They tend to make different decisions. They tend to, in many cases, make bad decisions and not be able to think ethically at all. But frequently, the result isn't just that they make really selfish decisions. They just don't make decisions. They can't, because that's the part that sort of pushes you in one direction or another. So these might be there sitting on the scale, but what's the equivalent of gravity, right? That's emotion, that's feeling. So if we have that little picture and we think, oh yeah, it's a bit like this, that means there's got to be something that is actually, it looks like some bizarre monster. But yeah, we might think of emotion as something like the gravity that is actually giving the weight to the reasons, right? Making them matter.
Doesn't emotion also sometimes define whether it's good or bad?
Absolutely.
You know, it'll choose which side of the
Which side of the scale it's going on. That's right. And a lot of people will make decisions. They'll imagine themselves having made this decision. Think, how would I feel about that? Imagine yourself making the other decision. How do I feel about that? And the feeling is a kind of guide to that. So I think that's right. It's not just a question of giving them all the weight, but deciding on the polarity, which side of the scale they belong on. Yeah.
Because I feel, recently we had a discussion, like open houses regarding the Jefferson Davis statue here in
Yes,
campus.
right.
I went to both of them, and you can hear the passion, the emotion of this is what I believe, and it makes it hard then for someone to be logical and say, okay, can we talk about this? Because they're blinded by, but that's my heritage, or that's this, and it can be very, make you more firm in your thoughts, and really not be able to hear, you know what, it's not virtuous what you're thinking, or what you're saying, or et cetera.
Right. No, good. So one model of this is to think of emotion as something like gravity, giving me force. A second model, though, and this is one that's really common in Enlightenment philosophers of certain kinds, is to think of emotion as a threat to reason. In other words, it's not what is actually sort of working along with reason, it's sort of confusing things. So here the thought is, now I don't know how to draw a picture of this, but it's something like, here's the brain, like a computer that is carefully keeping things charted and categorized and so on. And now here's the brain on emotion. Right? It's like, and in fact, I draw it this way partly because in Chinese philosophy it's a very common image. Emotions are a cloud that befogs the mind. The clear mind is one that is looking at things without emotion. So here it's like an emotional fog. It's a cloud. It's something that is getting in the way of decision making. And that's often the way it feels. If we didn't care about anything, it would be hard to make decisions. On the other hand, if you care about things too much, it's hard to make decisions, right? So there's some truth to both of those models. Now a third appears in Confucius, and that's where he says, look, there are virtues of thought. I have to think about things in the right way. And he says, if I think about things in the right way, then I will have virtues of feeling. I will feel the right way about things. And if I do that, then I will have virtues of action. So as he sees it, feeling is actually an essential link between thought and action. Here is the person thinking about what to do. So I'm going to draw them scratching their head. And then here's the person actually acting. And how do I get from here to there? That's the role of emotion. And the thought is, yes, it's essential to getting me there. So in that way, it's rather like this first model, the gravity model. But then you could say, look, it's an independent thing to some extent. If I'm not thinking about things right in the first place, then I'm gonna feel wrongly about things. And so, actually, the flag controversy is a good illustration, because it's a symbol, but what exactly is it a symbol of? It's a symbol of different things to different people. And that means different emotions get triggered in different people. People, ideally, are empathetically trying to think, well, okay, I know what it means to me, here's what it means to you. And then you're trying to imagine the other person's emotions in connection with yours. And it's, yeah, exactly, through empathy, it's very easy for that to become a jumble. And to sort this all out. Yeah, I was one of the faculty members who was asked to give input to that committee. No, I wasn't serving, but a friend of mine was, so I was asked to. So I wrote this very long thing that was.
Was it emotional?
No, because actually I don't care. It's not a symbol that means much of anything to me, so it's like, huh. So in a way, that made it very easy for me to write some long thing and think about it, right? Because I didn't actually, it's not a symbol of much of anything to me. On the other hand, that means that it was hard for me to really come to grips with. So mostly I just wrote long biographies of all the people involved and said nasty things about Woodrow Wilson, because I really disliked Woodrow Wilson, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, to some extent, if you don't have this, then it means all you can do is give background, because you don't really share in all of this, except insofar as you try to empathize with people who do. But then, I mean, here's the background. I'm from Pittsburgh. Threaten the Steelers, I care a lot. Confederate flag is like, I don't know. I never really had, well, anyway, never mind. So the point is really, yeah, it's my emotions, but then I've got to also anticipate the feelings of others and think about that. Empathy gets involved, it gets complicated. And that's why it's hard to do this right. Confucius says, look, there are 3 levels here. Before you can even do the right thing, you've got to feel the right way about it, because you're not going to do the right thing if you don't feel the right way about it, but you're not going to feel the right way unless you're thinking about it the right way. And so, in a sense, for him, it all comes back to virtues of thought. They're the most fundamental. He acts as if feeling, it would be too simple to say feeling follows thinking on his view, because it can be clouded, it can mess it up. But on the other hand, this is a prerequisite for feeling the right way. If you're not thinking about it right, you're certainly not going to feel the right way about it. Okay, that's anyway one thing I wanted to talk about with respect to Confucius. One thing goes right back to our basic questions of ethics. What should I do? What should I be, and on what reasons may I act? Because Confucius is the first person, I think, to recognize that those are the 3 basic questions, and to develop a theory that incorporates all of them. What does he refer to? What should I do? That's basically the question that in Chinese is Li. In other words, propriety. He talks a lot about the rules of propriety, which are the rules of proper behavior. Doing the appropriate thing. That's broader than just the right thing from a purely moral point of view. It has to do with what's appropriate. And he says, look, learn the conventions. Figure out what the social rules are. And it's not just a question of thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, etc., although those things matter. And in fact, are very important. This is a broader question. You walk into a classroom, what should you do? Well, yes, you shouldn't kill anybody, you shouldn't steal, etc., but that's not that informative, I hope. You probably weren't tempted to do those things anyway. What do you do? What are the rules of classroom behavior? There are all sorts of things you may do in other contexts you may not do here, right? For example, dancing. Okay, good. Right. I mean, you can, there's nothing, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with dancing, but on the other hand, don't do it in class, right? And we all understand that there's a certain kind of decorum expected. Well then, what should you do? That's much broader than an ethical question. And Confucius stresses, look, this is about practice in all sorts of aspects of life, not just in specially defined moral situations. Now, then there's the question of what should I be? His term for that is red. And that's usually translated as virtue, or benevolence is often a translation. You should be a virtuous person. And then on what reasons may I act? This is what he means by yi, which is usually translated as righteousness. But that's to some extent a lousy translation. Some people translate it as justice. But when he is talking about this, he says, look, the person of ye is someone who does the right thing for the right reason. They do it because it's right. The small-minded person thinks of gain. The person of ye, the person who is righteous, is someone who thinks about what is right. And so we think of righteousness as a specifically religious virtue, the righteous person, or maybe righteous indignation. It's a very limited term in English. This is something much broader. It really just is a matter of, look, the person of ye is thinking about the right kinds of things. They're not behaving selfishly, just thinking what's in it for me. They're thinking more broadly about what's the right thing to do. And so, in a way, we don't have a good term for that in English. I don't know how to translate that. The person of ye is the person who acts on the basis of the reasons they're supposed to be acting on the basis of. Okay, so those are different components of the theory. Oh, I've got 5 minutes left. I budgeted my time very poorly. But that's okay, because I want to actually just make one other point that's fundamental. And that point has to do with something that pops up in the very beginning of the Analects. The very first Analect is not some big, grand thing, such as opens most great texts of world religions or philosophy. What's the very first line of Genesis? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, right? Boom! Right, Cecil B. DeMille. It's a big beginning. Or, gosh, well, we're going to look at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, the first statement. It's a big dramatic one in a way. Not that dramatic, it's not like heaven and earth get created, but he says, every action, every art, every inquiry aims at some good. The metaphysics of Aristotle begins with everyone, by nature, desires to know. These are big, sweeping claims. Confucius instead starts, isn't it pleasant? Actually, how does he start? Isn't it pleasant to have friends coming from far away? Isn't he a person of complete virtue who doesn't get upset when other people don't appreciate him? Now I need to get it exact because it matters precisely what it is. Yeah, good. Isn't it pleasant to learn and to apply what you've learned? Isn't it delightful to have friends coming from far away? Isn't he a person of complete virtue who doesn't get angry that others don't appreciate him? Now, what's going on there? Actually, something very, very important is going on there. But it sounds humdrum. It sounds everyday. Here, however, is what's happening. Isn't it pleasant to learn and to apply what you've learned? That's a question of knowledge, right? And knowledge pertains to your own relationship with what? Yourself, right? It's sort of an internal thing. And so the most fundamental level of things in Confucius is yourself. But the second thing, isn't it delightful to have friends coming from far away? There is this level of our family and our friends. And those are very important. And then finally, these other people. Okay, well then just others, strangers, in other words, or acquaintances, people with whom we have no special relation. And really throughout the Analects, the point is there are different rules for these different kinds of relationships. He says, few filial and fraternal people like to offend their superiors, and nobody who doesn't like to offend superiors likes to stir up rebellion. The superior person attends to the root of things. From the root grows the way. The way here is in Chinese Tao. It's just the right way to live, the path, the proper way to behave, the proper way to be. Filial piety and fraternal submission are the root of benevolence. Ren, in other words, virtue. So what is the root of virtue? The superior person attends to the root. What is the root of virtue? Well, these two things, two special virtues, filial piety and fraternal submission. Those are at the level of people we interact with. And some of them, filial piety, that's proper attitude, proper respect for your parents, your elders. And so it pertains to vertical relationships. Okay, some people you have an intimate relationship with, and there's a kind of authority structure there, right? Parents are to be honored by their children, and then parents also then have obligations to their children. These obligations run both ways. But then there is brother to sister, there is friend to friend, a horizontal aspect to relationships. So you might say, in Confucius's model, there are really 4 kinds of relationships. There is this sort of vertical relationship, which has to do with authority. There is this kind of peer-to-peer relationship, which has to do with equality. There is the relationship you have to yourself, and then maybe to others in your